Hello, everyone. My name is Adam Williams, and you are listening to another episode of Retail Redeveloped. I am very, very excited to be coming from my makeshift podcast studio in my 5-year-old's discarded room. But don't let my surroundings fool you. I have an extremely exciting guest joining me today, one Steve Dennis. Now, Steve has done many, many things in his retail career: consultant, keynote speaker, author, Forbes contributor, senior executive for Fortune 500 retailers, MBA from Harvard, author of the new book, Remarkable Retail: How to Win and Keep Customers in the Age of Digital Disruption. He's done it all. I have very much enjoyed reading his work and following him on Forbes and just soaking up his knowledge on all things retail. Steve, thank you so much for taking time out of your day and joining me today on Retail Redeveloped.
You bet. Happy to join you.
Well, Steve, before we get started and really start nerding out on all things retail, do me a favor and just explain to everyone kind of who you are, why you do what you do, how you became, a thought leader in the retail space, and just explain to everybody, how you came to sit in the seat that you're in now.
Sure. Well, I'll try. I mean, it's certainly been a long, strange trip. I have been in retail, I guess, almost 30 years now. I didn't really set out necessarily to be in retail. I spent the first few years of my career at a big consulting firm, a little bit of time in the CPG arena, and then I ended up going to work at Sears in the early 90s. And really it was a desire to make a transition into more of an operating role from being more of a strategic planning guy. And that largely played out, and really over about a 15, 16-year period, I just kind of jumped back and forth between different roles throughout Sears. And then later on, I went to the Neiman Marcus Group as the chief strategy officer and head of multi-channel marketing. And I just had this really diverse set of experiences. Got into the e-commerce world and the so-called multi-channel, omni-channel world pretty early on as well. And then got tired of the corporate life and went out on my own as a consultant. And then just over really the last few years, started getting more interested in speaking and writing. And it's just all kind of evolved from there. It wasn't necessarily part of some master plan. It was just kind of a sense of wanting to leverage my experience and hopefully help people navigate this world of digital disruption, and now I guess COVID-19 disruption. So here I am. Yeah, and I decided about 2 years ago to work on a book to put all these ideas together, which just came out a few weeks ago.
Well, let's start with the book. That's a pretty good segue. What made you want to kind of catalyze your years of experience in a book? And walk me through that experience and the kind of the core message. Obviously, it has a very, very kind of sharp point to it. Boring retail is dead. I mean, you're not sugarcoating your language, and you walk people through some very specific ways that you would kind of inject life and change into a brand. But walk us through the book, what made you want to do it, and what you would consider kind of the core principle of the book.
Sure. Well, first, in terms of my why, that was kind of twofold. For a number of years, I've felt, as cliche as it sounds, I felt like I had a book in me. I've always liked to write, both more on the creative side as well as nonfiction. Got quite a lot of experience writing my blog and being a Forbes contributor for 3 or so years now. So I sort of felt like that was going to be kind of a capstone project or bucket list thing. The question really was, okay, if I'm going to write a book, what is it going to be about? And what really started to coalesce, I think, mostly as I started doing more keynote speaking, was I had to try to put together a story around what I thought was important and what retailers and people in the retail industry more broadly should do about it. And the narrative, I guess, really just started to come together over a period of time. And then I guess, somewhat selfishly in terms of a marketing vehicle, book's a good way to sort of market yourself as a consultant and thought leader and so forth. But also I realized that there are only a small number of companies I'm going to get to work with as a consultant. There are only so many people that are going to hear me speak at a conference or what have you. And I really wanted to have something that could reach a broader audience, but also go into a lot more depth than I can in a Forbes article or a speech. So it all just came together. And then basically the way the book is structured, which is often, frankly, the way I do speeches and workshops, is in two parts. The first part, which I call Shift Happens, is really my take on how we got to where retail is. I can't say today because obviously I had to finish writing the book several months ago. So a few things have happened since then, which I imagine we'll talk about. But really, what was the evolution of retail? How are consumer preferences, desires, et cetera, changing? How is technology, digital disruption shifting the landscape dramatically? And really what's most important for those in the retail industry to focus on? And then part two, which I call the Journey to Remarkable, and features this framework that I've been using for a while called the 8 Essentials of Remarkable Retail, is really kind of the roadmap to make that change happen. So yeah, that's what the book is about. And I give some case studies and other things for people to think about. But I really wanted to write a book. I think there are quite a few books in retail that are very historical. There's some books that are very kind of high-level, conceptual, futuristic, what have you. And there's some definitely good books out there, many of which I've read and cite in my book. But I really wanted to get something that I think that was both hard-hitting, objective, a little bit in your face, but also pragmatic. So we'll see. Hopefully I got close to that goal.
Well, I think it's extremely pragmatic and couldn't be any more timely. So I want you to walk us through the 8 essentials. But before you do that, I read a excerpt of one of your speeches where you talked about your time with one of the big box stores, dominant big box stores that has kind of ascended, hit an epigee, is now heading the other way, and how you guys spent 20 years watching retail happen to you. And I thought that was so interesting and put me in that conference room and talk to me about what happens when a legacy retailer sees change coming, maybe knows they should be doing something about it, but is kind of paralyzed by, I don't know if it's fear of failure or if it's just a lack of understanding. Walk me through that and walk me through perhaps some lessons that came out of the other side now that you've got that wonderful perspective of time. And just walk me through that if you don't mind before we dig in.
Sure. Well, that's probably a book or two unto itself. So I'll try to be relatively concise. But yeah, I mean, my time at Sears, a lot. It's easy, particularly now looking back. And I've been gone from Sears for 17 years or something. But yeah, I mean, most of my time there, I was working on really the growth issues that were becoming increasingly challenged for Sears, and worked both on corporate strategy, but also worked on launching quite a few new concepts as a reaction to what was emerging. And in many respects, Sears, and I tell the story a little bit in the book, in 1999, we had 1999, fall of 1999, we had a leadership retreat where one of the things we ended up talking about was the future impact of e-commerce. And Arthur Martinez, who was the CEO at the time, kind of wrapped up the conference saying that the future of Sears, or the future of our brand, will be largely based upon our ability to meet our customers' needs anytime, anywhere, any way. Which, in retrospect, 20 plus years later, was, an incredibly forward-thinking mantra. And I actually ended up being asked to head up what we called at the time the multi-channel integration initiative, to start to put some of those ideas into place, which later served me well when I had a similar role at Neiman Marcus. But Sears saw many of the things that were going to happen with the future of retail, and also clearly, and I worked on a number of these things, saw the impact, even going back 20 years, of big box retail like Home Depot and Lowe's, and a number of things that ended up making Sears increasingly irrelevant over time. And so it's, there's a lot to unpack, I think, in terms of strong cultures and how hard it is to move, turn the big ship, as the cliche goes. But I would say it's certainly not for lack of knowing. I don't think, and one of the things I talk about a little bit in the book is, there's one thing to be aware of the changes that are coming. We certainly were. We didn't have perfect vision, but we certainly were aware. I think it's another thing to really accept how profound some of the changes are going to be. And that's definitely where I think we suffered, and I see a lot of retailers suffer. They don't fully, they may have a general sense of what's going on, but they don't really accept what it really means for their business, or maybe they don't realize, particularly in the last decade, how quickly things are changing, more of the exponential impact as opposed to linear. But the big thing is the courage to act. And I do think, as you alluded to, oftentimes it is fear. It is, doing more analysis,
paralysis
doing
through
small measures.
analysis.
Yeah. Or, it is, and I'll be, as much as I think I have some good ideas in the book and other things I speak and write about. It is a very vexing issue for these big legacy retailers to really acknowledge that staying still or availing yourself of half measures, so to speak, is not enough. That's actually the riskiest thing you can do. But Steve, to make those big bets is, it's not a trivial risk either.
Well, so Steve, let me ask you this: what separates so let's talk about legacy companies for a moment. What separates a Nike or a Walmart or one of these legacy companies that is very much trying to strive to stay on the bleeding edge, is willing to take risks, is willing to make mistakes, versus a company like Sears that maybe saw the writing on the wall well in advance and still just slowly had this kind of march, this death march. What separates those two types of companies?
Well, one caveat I would have is I would say that I don't want to diminish the challenges that retailers like Sears and certainly what we're seeing playing out now with JCPenney and Macy's and others. It is very difficult to both have a culture that's, which I'll get to more in a second, but a culture that's not really wired to say yes or fully embraces innovation. But when we're also saddled with assets that are essentially misplaced for the future, in Sears' case, having so much of their real estate tied up in regional malls, it's very easy to be glib about the need for change, but it is an especially vexing issue to try to reinvent yourself. So, but with that said, I think, the foundation is this awareness and full acceptance of what is really going on. And I think the companies that have best navigated the past decade or so are definitely very, very rooted in really understanding their customers at a very in-depth level and not subscribing to kind of these broad brush, one size fits all prescriptions. So, but the second thing I think is really seeing innovation as a core discipline, not just kind of an ideas program. With companies, I mean, I've noticed this over the years. A lot of retailers will have, very significant efforts against things, you could argue is, I don't want to say trivial, but mundane, as like loss prevention and visual merchandising. And, there'll be big efforts against that. But when you actually try to carve out what their budget and what their capabilities are when it comes to research and development and product innovation, there's hardly anything there. So when you look at a company like Nike, which has certainly been around for a while, I think their heritage in product innovation has actually served them well as they've gotten deeper and deeper into retail.
They were born out of innovation. That was the
they were born out of innovation, and they saw it, I think, as a really. And I worked with Nike a little bit, prior client of mine a few years ago, so I got to see a little bit of this firsthand. But I think that innovation mindset, and seeing it as a serious discipline and understanding you have to try a lot of things. There isn't sort of this big boom kind of approach to innovation, really serves them well. And I think if you look, I mean, obviously that's very much part of Amazon's culture. I think if you look at some of these newer direct-to-consumer brands, that's very embedded in the way they approach things. And then they have the advantage, those digitally native vertical brands in particular have the advantage of not having to undo their legacy real estate or legacy systems and culture. So I think it's it's certainly a hard thing for brands that have been around a long time to really learn. You tended to get to and I have a whole little riff I do on the book on this, but you tended to get to the top of most of these major retail chains in the past by coming up through the merchandising ranks. And that was about, selecting the right product and negotiating terms with vendors and all that kind of stuff. And, that remains certainly an important part of retail. At the same time, you didn't necessarily get the kind of skill set you need for this new era by only spending, 20, 30 years in the merchandising ranks. So I think that's another thing that has made it more difficult for some retailers to adapt to what's emerged in the past decade or so.
So what do you think the perfect new retail CEO looks like? Is it somebody that started a tech company and knows how to kind of hunter-gather online? Is it a products innovation expert? Who do you think the ideal CEO would be today?
Well, I think generally you have to have kind of the core leadership qualities that any CEO needs to have. I don't know that, which is I think largely about being a generalist, being very strategic, knowing in particular how to build in agile functions to your company. And then you have to surround yourself with the right domain experts, I guess, for lack of a better term. So I don't know. I mean, it's certainly helpful to have come from a digital technology background. But I will say, I've certainly seen, and I think we see this certainly with some of the venture capital funded fast growing companies where the lack of broader experience has hindered some executives. So I don't know that there's any one domain profile necessarily. But if you don't understand the myriad of factors that come into play in the customer experience in retail today, and you're not availing yourself of the best talent, you're likely to fall further and further behind.
So let's jump into the book. Walk us through kind of your core principle and the 8 essentials of remarkable retail and why, how you came up with those principles, why you think they should be the driving force. And just if somebody hasn't read the book, just give them that taste of why you think this is so important.
Sure. Well, first of all, the underlying premise of the book, which I largely set up in the first part, is this idea that even very good is not good enough anymore. And one of the things, and frankly, this is something I largely borrowed from my friend Seth Godin and some of the ideas that he's been putting forward for a while, but in particular launched in his book Purple Cow, was this idea that in a world of growing abundance, if you think about the escalation and growth we've seen of of product availability, product and pricing information, places you can buy things, the ability to buy just about anything you want from anywhere in the world 24/7, that what it takes to really get noticed in the first place amidst all this noise and information is pretty difficult. And if you're going to consistently win, keep, and grow customers, the bar for performance just keeps rising, particularly if you don't want to get caught up in the race to the bottom of only being able to drive your business through discounts. So the fundamental premise is that you have to be even more remarkable, literally, to be able to succeed in this world. And one thing I talk about a little bit is how we've seen the so-called bifurcation of retail, where success over the past decade in particular has been found at either end of the spectrum, where the price and convenience sort of retailers like Amazon, Walmart, dollar stores, TJX, et cetera, has been pretty strong. And you've also seen pretty good success at the more premium specialty upscale sort of stores, whether that's Apple or Ulta or Restoration Hardware, et cetera. But it's been really untenable, and I think becoming even more obvious by the pandemic that you cannot stake out this middle ground. So you really have to pick a lane and be more remarkable. So then what I try to do in the second part of the book is describe more fully, well, what does that mean? What are the essential elements of a business strategy that is going to be, not only get you through the tough times, but really create sustainable, profitable growth for the long term? So the 8 essentials really came about over time from some of the principles that I started to learn when I was in senior roles, most recently at Neiman Marcus. But then as I went out and started working with clients and started studying what was going on in the industry, and I just more or less have pressure tested those over time and iterated through them and found that hopefully these 8 do a pretty good job of being reasonably comprehensive and distinct.
So I want to talk a little bit more about you mentioned at Sears, at Neiman. It sounds like you were in kind of a front runner to the omni-channel, trying to figure out what omni-channel means. It doesn't really sound like omni-channel is the way you like to describe retail today and the different channels. Would you walk people through what you think about omni-channel and how you would describe it and who you see as doing a great job, who you see as needing some help?
Sure. Well, so I've lived through several iterations of this. Early on, it was really as e-commerce became sort of the elevated version of mail order catalog. We certainly had plenty of retailers. Certainly directly in my experience at Sears and Land's End and Neiman's that were operating in multiple channels. Then it became more common to start talking about multi-channel integration, and then eventually omni-channel and frictionless commerce and these sort of things. I never, as popular as omni-channel became, I never really felt that it was a super helpful term for a few reasons. One is, to be overly literal about it, perhaps, I don't think it was ever about being everywhere for the customer. Certainly we need to be mindful of all the new ways to interact with our brand, but it was really about showing up in remarkable ways where it really mattered. And I think a lot of retailers, for them, omni-channel was really more about just becoming e-commerce enabled, which I'll come back to in a second. But the other was really they kind of like everybody out for a pass, that they just tried a lot of new stuff and it didn't have a ton of focus. And that ended up being incredibly expensive and in many cases not getting the results that we all wanted. So the term that I've been using for the last several years and is actually essential number 3 in my framework is what I call harmonized retail. And this is the idea, first of all, that recognizing that all this discussion about the different channels is not particularly helpful. Almost every brand that I know of and every set of data that I've looked at, most consumers are active in multiple channels. In fact, sometimes they go back and forth between channels in a matter of seconds. And most retailers that have any kind of significant online business find that their best customers regularly shop in multiple channels. And so really, I always talk about the customer being the channel, and it's our job as retailers to put together a customer experience that is remarkable, but is also very well harmonized across all the different touch points. And so the reason I use the term harmonized, I'm deliberately being a little bit evocative, but it's this idea that all aspects of the customer experience that are important really sing well together, that you not only eliminate, if you think about a musical performance, if anybody in the band plays the wrong note or gets off rhythm or what have you, that's very obvious to people right away and makes for a very unpleasing experience. So one thing is definitely eliminating the so-called discordant notes or pain points or friction points, or there's various things you can call them. But even more important, that's kind of table stakes, I think, today, but even more important in terms of really differentiating yourself is to find those places that you can really soar, that they're, things that you can really amplify, that will really distinguish yourself. So that's why, that's why I guess I've both challenged the term omnichannel as not being particularly helpful, or at least having different definitions for different retailers, and try to put forward this idea of harmonized retail.
I want to dig into something that you mentioned during that explanation. The customer is the channel. This is something that I'm starting to hear more people touch on. It's something that I think merits a little bit more explanation. Would you mind unpacking what you mean by the customer as the channel a little bit more?
Sure. So one of the things I mentioned in my book is the other thing that happened at this 1999 Sears conference that I mentioned was a guy named Bob Thacker, who was one of the VPs of marketing. One of the things we were talking about is this idea that we have to show up anytime, anywhere, anyway for our customers. And we started to talk about this idea that what keeps us from doing that was all the different silos we had in the company. And so that was organizational silos and information silos and different tech platforms and all this kind of stuff. So pretty early on, and I definitely carry this with me when I got to Neiman Marcus in 2004, was this idea that our brand is what the customers care about. They don't necessarily care about, and in fact, this is borne out by research that I've seen over the years, they don't really care how we happen to be organized, first and foremost. The customers don't think about channels, they think about brands. And more, when the customer can access our brand on a smart device anywhere they are, what does even matter anymore? A customer can be standing in line at the Department of Motor Vehicles and be shopping from us and deciding whether they're going to order online when they get home in that moment, or use that mobile device to check our store hours, or order online, pick up in store. And suddenly shopping just becomes this blur. And so, these trends have just been accelerating over the years. I've seen plenty of data in my own direct experience at retailers, and then more recently as a consultant, where we just see customers going back and forth between what we call channels all of the time, and where, in particular, smart devices are kind of the connective tissue between these channels. And so I just think both in terms of how we organize our data and do more personalized marketing and redesign customer experiences, if we don't start with the customer, which seems obvious, but basically not pay that much attention to where they happen to transact, we end up getting to a better outcome. And I think the retailers that see it that way have largely outperformed the ones that don't.
So that's a really good segue. I actually have a write-in question from a friend of mine, Katie Grissom with Asana Partners. Shout out to Katie. She wants to know, consumers have come to expect products and services how, when, and where they want, or literally on demand. And thinking through how the crisis, talking about COVID-19, what we're all dealing with right now, might accelerate consumer trends, which have recently driven innovation around in-store fulfillment and buy online, pick up in store, et cetera. What else might shift in terms of consumers' wants and needs related to retail on the other side of this that could change the retail landscape?
Well, that's a great question. I will probably give you a very weak answer in that I think there's some obvious trends which will accelerate, which I'll talk about in a second. But I think it's just this particular crisis is so profound and still playing out that I think is really hard to predict what the future will hold. And I also think, at least from my experience going through the financial crisis and even going back to 9/11, we can't rely very much on what consumers tell us they're going to do in the future. Most consumers, from my experience, tend to be very bad at predicting their future behavior. So I just caveat that by saying I think it's really, really hard to know specifically how this will play out. But I certainly think that most of the trends that we saw coming into the crisis, buy online, pick up in store, or now more curbside, contactless payment, the general shift of transactions to digital channels. I mean, those all will be amplified. I think it's just difficult to tell long term to what degree until things start to settle out. But I have a hard time thinking of any major trends that aren't accelerated substantially. So I don't know if that's a bit of a non-answer. I don't know.
That's all right. It's another good segue into, obviously you wrote the book, perfect timing about retail landscape changing. Your book comes out and then the retail landscape gets hit by a tidal wave. What would you have written differently? How did this change your perspective? What would, version 2.0 redact or change? Walk me through kind of how your perspective has changed as we're going through this insane crisis in real time.
Sure. Well, I actually think, I'm sure that if I had had the benefit of this experience and I were writing the book right now or a few months down the road, I'm sure there are many things that I would comment on, but I really do feel like the major things I say in the book are even more true now. This idea, particularly when you think about, and again, it remains to be seen the specific shape of this going forward. But I think we're absolutely in a period where this bifurcation of retail that I talked about earlier is even more pronounced. I predicted the collapse of the so-called middle, a number of years ago. I think that, basically what I say in the book is that it won't be long before the middle is hollowed out completely. When I wrote that, my perspective was, more like 2 or 3 years down the road, as opposed to what's starting to look more like 2 or 3 months. So, clearly a lot of that reckoning of the undifferentiated, unremarkable middle has been brought forward. I talk a lot about, particularly at the end of the book, about the need to be that the world is increasingly uncertain and volatile, and that really requires that we become fundamentally more agile as businesses. So I think that's absolutely amplified. So, it's just unfortunate. Obviously, the human impact, the human toll is horrible. Obviously the deaths and the sickness, also the degree of unemployment, and just general homelessness, hardship, et cetera, et cetera. But it's also going to, I think, catch quite a few businesses that, you could argue did not deserve to die, just because they don't have the cash flow. And I don't think there's any degree of government action that's necessarily going to be able to save all of them. So So that, that's the part, and the ripple effects of that over time and how that will change consumer psychology as we go forward. I'm not talking about like the next 3 months, but, into 2021 and beyond. That's the hard thing, I think, to predict. But, I don't want to be one of these people that says, I told you so. But, I was going back and reading over some things in the book where I'm, sort of beseeching companies to take more risks, be more agile, experiment more. And, I think those that heeded my advice would have been able to weather this a little bit better. But, we don't have a time machine until Elon Musk invents one. So we have to do the best we can. So, I hope I got asked the other day whether a lot of the things I've been talking about the need for innovation and, some of the things we talked about earlier, that whether this crisis would really cause some companies to wake up to the need. And, it's not a question you asked me, but it's one where I'm really not sure, because I've just seen, from my experience over the last 15 or 20 years, that despite all the evidence of companies needing to change, many retailers did basically watch the last 20 years happen to them. So I don't know how much of a punch in the face it takes to get some people to wake up. I'm actually more worried that because of how harsh this crisis was, it may actually cause many retailers to be more risk averse, and to be ready to weather the next black swan event. And then the problem is you may die a slow death from irrelevance. So you just can't plan for every possible outcome. So it's just I think going to be really interesting to see how this plays out. But I think definitely further bifurcation, acceleration of most trends. I think a very significant contraction of spending in most areas for a prolonged period. Consolidation, where some of the stronger companies will become more powerful by virtue of either competitors going out of business or, in some cases, them buying up some of these companies at distressed prices. So it's certainly going to be a pretty cataclysmic year under any circumstances.
There's no question. Let's speaking of cataclysms, let's talk about that hollowing of the middle. Would you mind walking me through? If you don't want to mention specific brands, that's fine. But in your mind, who is extremely susceptible to that hollowing out, to that middle, to that kind of vanilla ice cream of retail?
Yeah. Well, in terms of the big names, I think it's largely the mid-priced department stores. They're certainly the biggest sector,
like the Macy's of the world, basically.
Yeah, I would put, in terms of the of course, it's no news that many of these were, had weak balance sheets, struggling business performance, poor momentum coming into the crisis. So this obviously greatly exacerbates their troubles. So Macy's, Penny's, I kind of hesitate to even include Sears anymore, because I think they've been walking dead for a number of years. Dillard's, Belk's, I'd say even Kohl's. They're all suffering from this, as much of as a cliche it is to say, it's kind of sea of sameness and not really having a strong, compelling reason for being. Though some are certainly better positioned than others, both from a balance sheet perspective as well as from a value proposition. So I think, those businesses have been struggling to varying degrees for many, many years. And for the most part, they haven't done anything. Most of the strategies for improvement are pretty incremental. What I refer to often and talk about in the book as a slightly better version of mediocre. That they're so far from being truly remarkable to compete in the world we saw going into the crisis, much less the one we're entering now, that, what is their reason to exist? And when you layer on top what has been a problem for a while, the vast overstoring of retail space, a lot of it is certainly concentrated in the in the weaker malls, but even more broadly in power centers and other places. I think we're going to see a very, very harsh reckoning. So my expectation is that a very substantial percentage of, if you put all those stores together, however many locations that is, a couple thousand, I suppose, maybe more, that you will see maybe not the majority of those stores closed this year, but a very, very substantial percentage. I suspect, this is not very controversial at this point, but I suspect, Penny's is going to file for bankruptcy any day now and is probably a pretty significant candidate for liquidation. I certainly think that we'll see a lot of store closings from Macy's, and I think the troubles at Dillard's and Belk will probably become more apparent in the next few months. Kohl's is in a little bit different situation, being off the mall, but there's going to be this weird phenomenon of kind of last man standing. I got asked the other day how many moderate price department stores, because I put Nordstrom and Neiman Marcus and Saks in a little different category. But when I got asked, how many moderate department store chains there should be in the world, I said, well, 2, I think. And it's probably Kohl's and Macy's. I think everybody else, if they're not gone in the next few months, I think it's probably just kicking the can down the road.
Right. And you see Macy's, they get beat up all the time. In our world, people like to use them as a punching bag. But some of the things they're doing are kind of interesting. I think Beta's was a really interesting kind of play just to figure out, retail as a service is something new, something interesting. So they're at least paddling in the right direction and not just, as you said, watching retail happen to them. But
yeah, I give, I end up being, particularly in the book, but I certainly haven't changed my opinion in the last, since I finished the book in the fall. I think Macy's and Jeff Jeanette in particular has been much more willing compared to a lot of the more, the people we think of as these iconic legacy retailers. They have been much more willing to experiment with things. You mentioned Beta, even though I think the Story acquisition and experience has not turned out to live up to expectations. I think it's still good that they were willing to try stuff. So they absolutely should be applauded for doing that. I think the challenges at Macy's is just largely caught up in the difficulties in the whole middle, that it's a contracting space. It has been contracting for 2 decades, actually a little bit more. And this is all going to accelerate things. So, to really be remarkable in terms of how the consumer views you and to get to any semblance of decent financial returns, they still have, I think, a long way to go. But they may very well benefit from so many of their competitors downsizing massively or even going out of business. So, that's not a very exciting story, but there still is certainly some business to be done largely on the mall in that mid to upper middle space. It's just that's just continues to be a much smaller piece. So, I think they'll grab a greater share of a shrinking pie, basically. Better way to say it, maybe.
Well, let's take a second and focus a little bit on that topic. We're talking a lot about malls. We're talking a lot about large footprints, large number of stores that for good reason we both think might not be open and operating here this time next year. Let's say that Simon, Brookfield, CBL, Site Center, somebody like that is bringing you in and saying, "Hey, Steve, we've got a bunch of big box. We've got a bunch of GLA that is empty right now. Help us fill it up, or help us consult on who you think is that next wave of retailer that might have a pulse and might make a really good addition to a merchandising mix." Because over the last few years, we've been in a really interesting space in retail. We've had a lot of discussion on kind of Amazon-resistant retail. There's been a massive focus on entertainment, experience, restaurant. Now the thought of going to a hip, cool bowling alley and putting on somebody else's shoes and
Yeah, yeah.
rubbing elbows with 1,000 other people. It's a different context than it was a month ago. So walk me through, how you cross the bridge here. What is on the other side? What would you tell Simon? What would you tell Brookfield, one of these people, that would be where you would place your bet moving forward?
Sure. So, well, I certainly think we have to have the perspective of contraction and consolidation, as I mentioned earlier. Um, I don't, as much as people are starting to talk about online retail going to 50% or something like that, I think that's not going to happen. I think that when we get through the most, this next period, and I guess you might call it, let's say, the pre-vaccine period, and whether, the unfortunate thing is we don't know whether a vaccine is a year away or 3 years away or whatever, but I think there are plenty of good reasons why consumers will still want to ideally shop and go experience things in the analog world, I guess, for lack of a better term. We just don't know how soon we get close to any semblance of normalcy. So I think you have to plan for a prolonged period of contraction. I suspect that the very best malls will continue to be good malls. And a very substantial percentage of the other malls will either be bulldozed or massively repurposed. To your point about where things were already heading in terms of retenanting and repurposing of malls, I think, we have to take a more measured outlook in terms of the bowling alleys and the restaurants and all that kind of stuff. But I think fundamentally that will still be the long-term trend. But it may push more mixed use repurposing, residential, et cetera. So, I mean, I think the key is really to take a hard look at which retail formats, I'm using the term retail really broadly, will be viable and growing 2 years down the road, not get too caught up in the next 6 months or so, but to try to develop that perspective and take the long-term view as best you can, recognizing that some of the underlying trends, as I said earlier, that we were seeing going into the pandemic are going to continue, or in many cases be accelerated. But it's definitely a hard planning environment. Like I said, I don't think anybody really at this point can have a very clear view of the future, if only because we're in the middle of a crisis and it's hard to get clarity, as well as we just don't know, what the ability to eliminate or greatly manage the virus will be, and whether that's a 1 year horizon or much longer horizon. So I think you have to kind of be particularly agile and plan for multiple outcomes.
Yeah, I agree with that completely. Well, Steve, you've already been extremely generous with your time. I want to do two things. First off, please tell people how they can connect with you, how they can get a copy of the book, how they can interact with you if you're on social, or if you'd rather people email. Just explain to people how they can interact with you and how they can hear more about what you have to say.
Sure. So thanks for that. So my website is stephenpdennis.com. So that's Stephen with a V, P like Peter, Dennis, DENNIS.com. On social, at Stephen P. Dennis on Twitter and Instagram. So those are good ways to connect with me. As far as my book, it's pretty much available everywhere in all the usual formats. So if you want to support the man, I would say go to Amazon.com. If you want to support independent retailers, there's a newer platform called bookshop.org, which I would recommend, which is helping smaller independent bookstores get more of a digital presence. But Audible, Target, all those book is available there.
Very, very cool, and it's great. It's got a lot of insights. This audience is typically more professional in nature, a lot of commercial real estate with a retail focus, a lot of kind of retail thought leaders. And if you're listening to this, this will be right up your alley. So I want to hit you with a couple, off the top of your head, quick takes, the hot takes, right? Like first thing that pops into your mind. What are some of the ways that retailers are getting it right with customer experience? I know there's not a one size fits all model that others can copy or recreate, but who is doing it well, and what are they doing that's doing it right?
Well, I'd probably point to two things. I think one is really understanding the customer journey, particularly as it's mobile enabled, and leveraging that well. And I think Ulta, Starbucks are two companies that I think are really getting that right. And then I think it's more really kind of amplifying the memorable experience, and in some cases going against a typical way of thinking about it. So I think, for example, what Restoration Hardware is doing with their gallery stores is pretty incredible. Obviously, they're going to suffer a little bit for the few months in terms of those stores, that experience being largely brick and mortar based. I think another thing that's really interesting is what Nordstrom is doing with their local stores, these smaller formats that are getting closer to the customer, low real estate cost or lower real estate cost than their mall-based stores, and really enabling that harmonized retail experience by being a center for buy online, pick up in store, buy online, return in store, and just being more service oriented rather than being about just kind of stacking the merchandise high and trying to move inventory.
So how will the strategies for a positive customer experience change once we reopen? And as you noted, do you think people are going to show up, or are people going to be so used to shopping online that they don't need to go to the store anymore? I'll give you a quick example. I got my mom to order something online the other day, which was like trying to teach a dog to talk or something. She was so anti. She was still in the I don't want to give my credit card. Shout out to Carolyn. Love you, mom. She was so anti buy online, and then I got her to do something, and she was like, "Well, I'll be damned. Showed up in 2 days. It's no big deal. It's right here." So how do you predict? Is this going to get a lot of people that'll say, you know what, I'm just going to sit in front of my computer. I'm not going to get in the car.
Well, I think there are a few things to think about. I mean, one, I absolutely think the example you give with your mom and others that necessity or desperation has forced people to shop in really different ways. And I think, lots of people are going to discover that, wow, that's actually a pretty good experience. It's not as difficult as I thought, or I'm getting benefit from it that I couldn't imagine. So I think that will definitely accelerate many aspects of trends we were already seeing. So that will lead to higher online transactions. I think people are going to, there's still, one of the things I talk about in the book is what I call the differentiation between buying and shopping. The idea there that buying is much more task focused or on a mission, search driven and more price and convenience oriented. And that's what online shopping is really good at. And that's really where most of Amazon's sales, frankly, come from. Whereas shopping is more of an emotional, experiential experience where it's social, you want to talk to the sales associate, you want to touch and feel the product before you buy it. And I don't think that fundamentally those factors which tend to drive more physical store traffic, whether it's literally transacted there or not, I don't believe over time those factors will fundamentally go away. But I think that people will be, if it's not really an essential or perceived as essential, people are going to be hesitant to revert to their old behavior anytime soon. So that will cause more of a short-term distortion, either in terms of people just putting off spending or shifting to online. So I think what retailers, certainly as the rebound from this crisis becomes more obvious, I think what retailers have to really think about is really understand their customers better, dissect the customer journey, understand the role of digital versus brick and mortar, how they interact, and evolve their experience to deal with that. But I'm not in the camp that as I said earlier, that online is going to go to 50% or something like that. I mean, there's just too many barriers for that. One of the barriers I'll mention real quickly, which I think does not get nearly enough attention, and I've been on this for a while, is most of e-commerce is still not very profitable. And so as much as we see, particularly in the short term, more interest in certain features, for retailers to really either scale up to meet that demand if it's persistent, but be willing to invest aggressively, a lot of things have to change. You can't do small order home delivery at any volume and make money.
Right.
And so when I hear people talk about, grocery retail is going to be 30% online, I just like, well, no, there's just not, there's no way to get your head around that happening anytime soon, because the economics of that would put most retailers out of business. So you just have to, certainly pay a lot of attention to consumers' interest and adoption, and the potentials obviously for economics and technology to change over time. But you also cannot get over some of the fundamental barriers. I mean, just look at Amazon, right? I mean, Amazon had this great, and Target, right? They had this great sales increase, but their profits were terrible. And that's not, that mostly has to do with the underlying order economics, which are difficult to change anytime soon. So I think we just have to have that to sort of tamp down expectations of this massive long-term shift.
Last question, and then I'm going to let you get back to staying at home and quarantining like the rest of us.
Yeah, going through my books.
Right, exactly. Give me a new technology that has been introduced or maybe has become a little bit more widespread because of the shutdown that you think will kind of be sticky and be around after we all get back to normal life or new normal.
Well, I might mention two.
I'll let you get away with it. I was going to say one, but you can do two.
Okay.
That works.
Well, and I say this partially because one I think has been there, but is getting more adoption, which is really this, various iterations of order online, pick up in store. I think retailers have been really slow to adopt that for reasons I don't completely understand, but this crisis has really made them think about it. And I think, right now it's much more of a curbside pickup, but I think this idea of consumers doing their research and then not wanting to necessarily hang out in stores, but be able to get that immediate gratification, or as sometimes is overlooked, I think, by more affluent people, lots of people cannot safely get parcels delivered to their residence or their office, place of work. So I think any of these kind of digitally enabled, but fulfilled by a more traditional brick and mortar location, I think that will greatly accelerate. And then I think one that's, much more early is contactless payment. I think as people just presumably become even more hyper-focused on proximity and interaction with other people that might be deemed risky. Well, what are those technologies that reduce that risk? And I think contactless payment is one that I think will see its relatively low rate of adoption really pick up in the next year or so.
Well, Steve, this has been a lot of fun. I want to thank you again and just take a moment to acknowledge you coming on, sharing your expertise, sharing your knowledge as you do so well. Everybody go check him out. Sageberry Consulting, Steve Dennis. He's easy to find. LinkedIn, Instagram, Forbes, which is where I really, really enjoy following your stuff. Thank you so much for joining me, Steve. It was a lot of fun talking to you today about all things retail.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me on. I enjoyed it.